The auction block stood in the center of Silverdale like a gallows, drawing the eye with its macabre promise, and Bethany Miller fought back tears as her uncle dragged her toward it, his fingers digging into her arm like talons. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory was unforgiving to those who couldn't pay their debts, even more so to young women with no say in their fate. "Stand up straight, girl," Uncle Morris hissed, his breath reeking of whiskey as they approached the wooden platform. "The higher you fetch, the more of my debts get cleared." Bethany's heart hammered against her ribs. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd been tending to her small garden behind the cabin, dreaming of someday opening a shop in town with her modest savings. Then her parents' wagon had overturned at Blackwater Creek, and suddenly she was an orphan at 22, left in the care of an uncle who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. "Next up," the auctioneer called, his voice booming across the dusty town square. "A healthy young woman, suitable for cooking, cleaning, and companionship." The laughter that rippled through the crowd made Bethany's stomach turn. Her gaze swept over the men gathered before the platform, miners with dirt-crusted beards, ranchers with weathered faces, and a handful of well-dressed businessmen whose eyes held calculations colder than winter. In the back, half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, stood a tall figure leaning against a hitching post. Unlike the others, he wasn't leering or shouting crude suggestions. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer announced. "50, called a voice from the crowd. "60, shouted another. The figure at the back straightened slightly but remained silent as the bids climbed. Bethany kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, trying to escape in her mind, even as her body remained trapped on the auction block. $120, called a heavy-set man with a thick mustache whom Bethany recognized as Horace Blackwood, owner of the saloon at the edge of town. His reputation for how he treated his girls was well known throughout the county. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. 120 going once, $500. The crowd fell silent, turning to locate the source of the bid. The tall stranger stepped forward, the sunlight revealing a face that was handsome but serious, with eyes as blue as a summer sky and a strong jawline darkened with stubble. He couldn't have been more than 30, and unlike most men in these parts, his clothes, though trail-worn, were clean and well kept. "Did you say 500, mister?" the auctioneer asked, clearly stunned. "I did." The man's voice was calm but carried across the square with an authority that silenced even the drunkest hecklers. $500 going once, going twice." "Sold!" To the gentleman in the back. Uncle Morris's face split into a greedy grin. "That'll just about cover what I owe," he muttered, shoving Bethany toward the steps of the platform. The crowd dispersed, grumbling about the unexpected turn of events, while Blackwood shot the stranger a venomous glare before stalking away. Bethany stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, her legs trembling beneath her calico dress as her new owner approached. Up close, she could see a thin scar running along his left cheekbone, and the way his eyes seemed to take in everything around them with careful assessment. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. "Name's Preston Callahan," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "And I reckon you'd rather not stay in this town a minute longer than necessary." Bethany stared at him, searching for signs of the same predatory interest she'd seen in the other bidders. "Why did you pay so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something in his expression softened slightly. "No person should be sold like cattle," he said. "Especially not to the likes of Blackwood." Uncle Morris bustled over, hand outstretched. "A pleasure doing business with you, mister. She's a good worker, trained her myself these past weeks. Cooks decent enough, and I didn't ask for a list of her qualities." Preston cut him off, his tone turning cold as he counted out bills from a leather pouch. "And I doubt very much she's learned anything worthwhile from you." Morris's face reddened, but greed won out over pride as he snatched the money and counted it quickly. "She's yours now. Do what you want with her." "Miss," Preston said, turning back to Bethany and deliberately ignoring Morris, My horse is over yonder. We should be on our way before sundown if we aim to make it to my ranch by tomorrow. Bethany's throat tightened. Ranch. That could mean anything, a real property, or a lined shack in the middle of nowhere where no one would hear her scream. But what choice did she have? I need to collect my things, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Preston nodded. I'll wait. Under Morris's impatient supervision, Bethany gathered her meager possessions: 2 dresses, a brush, a small wooden box containing her mother's locket, and $53 she'd hidden in the lining of her coat. Everything she had in the world fit into a single carpetbag. When she emerged from the cabin, Preston was waiting with a magnificent chestnut gelding. He secured her bag behind the saddle, then offered his hand to help her mount. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work. You'll ride in front, he said, swinging up behind her with practiced ease. As they rode out of town, Bethany sat rigidly, uncomfortably aware of the stranger at her back. The warmth of his chest occasionally brushed against her shoulders as the horse navigated the uneven trail, but he maintained as much distance as the saddle allowed. I'm not taking you to be a slave or a companion, he said after they'd ridden in silence for nearly an hour. I want to make that clear. Then why did you buy me? Bethany asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. There was a long pause before he answered. My sister was sold the same way 3 years ago. I've been searching for her ever since. The pain in his voice was raw and unmistakable. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to another woman. Bethany twisted slightly to look at his face, and saw the truth written in the tight lines around his mouth. I'm sorry about your sister, she said softly. He nodded once, his eyes fixed on the horizon. My ranch is about a day's ride from here. I've got a cabin there where you can stay until you decide what you want to do. I'll give you work if you need it, or help you get to wherever you'd like to go. The tension in Bethany's shoulders eased slightly. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. As the sun began to set, Preston guided the horse off the main trail toward a small clearing beside a creek. We'll camp here for the night, he said, dismounting and then helping her down. They worked in near silence, Preston tending to the horse while Bethany gathered wood for a fire. As darkness fell, they sat on opposite sides of the flames, the crackling wood filling the awkward silence between them. How long have you had your ranch? Bethany finally asked, accepting the plate of beans and salt pork he offered. 5 years, Preston replied, his face softening slightly with pride. Started with nothing but 50 acres and 3 cows. Now I've got over 200 head and 300 acres. He took a bite of his food. It's good land. Creek runs through it year-round, and the north pasture stays green even in summer. And you work it alone? Got 2 hands who help with the cattle. Good men. He set his empty plate aside. There's a town about 2 hours' ride from the ranch, Juniper Creek. Small, but decent. Has a general store, a church. Even a schoolhouse now. Bethany nodded, trying to picture it. Any town would be an improvement over Silverdale, where her uncle had been only one of many unsavory characters. You have family somewhere? Someone I could help you get to? Preston asked. Bethany shook her head. My parents were my only family, besides Uncle Morris. They died at Blackwater Creek 3 weeks ago. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Their wagon overturned. Preston's expression darkened. I'm sorry. They were good people, Bethany said, staring into the fire. My father taught school back east before his lungs got bad and the doctor recommended the drier air out west. My mother loved to garden. She could make anything grow, even in the poorest soil. And you? Preston asked. What did you do before? Before I became property? Bethany finished with unexpected bitterness. She immediately regretted her tone when she saw him flinch. I'm sorry. That wasn't directed at you. I helped my parents with their small farm. I can cook, sew, tend a garden. I was saving to maybe open a little shop someday. Preston nodded. Those are good skills. Useful ones. Silence fell between them again, broken only by the snap of the fire and distant coyote calls. Eventually, Preston stood and retrieved a bedroll from his saddlebags. "You take this," he said, laying it out on one side of the fire. "I'll keep watch for a while." Bethany wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't tired, but exhaustion suddenly weighed on her like a physical burden. "Thank you," she said, lowering herself onto the bedroll. Despite her circumstances, the rhythmic sounds of Preston cleaning his rifle and the horse occasionally snorting in the darkness lulled her into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since her parents' death. She woke to the smell of coffee and opened her eyes to find Preston already dressed and tending to a small morning fire. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the eastern horizon in delicate shades of pink and gold. "Morning," he said, offering her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Bethany admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Thank you." They ate a simple breakfast of hardtack and dried apple slices before breaking camp. The day promised to be warm, with clear skies stretching endlessly above them as they rode. Bethany found herself relaxing slightly as Preston pointed out landmarks and shared bits of local history. "See that ridge there?" he said, gesturing toward a distinctive rock formation in the distance. "Old-timers say a Spanish expedition buried gold there back in the 1700s. Every few years some fool spends months digging around, but nobody's ever found anything." "Do you believe it exists?" Bethany asked. Preston chuckled, the sound warm and unexpected. "I believe in the things I can see and touch: my land, my cattle, the work of my hands. Chasing legends is a good way to starve." By midday, the landscape had changed from rolling prairie to more varied terrain, with stands of pine and aspen breaking up the grasslands. They stopped to rest by a small stream, where Preston filled their canteens while Bethany stretched her legs, wincing at the soreness from riding. "Not used to horses?" he asked, noticing her discomfort. "Not for long journeys," she admitted. "We had an old mare for plowing, but I mostly walked where I needed to go." Preston nodded. "We're making good time. Should reach the ranch by late afternoon." As they continued their journey, Bethany found herself studying Preston when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet confidence to him, different from the swaggering bravado she'd seen in so many Western men. His hands were strong and weathered, but they handled the reins with surprising gentleness. She wondered about the life that had shaped him, about the sister he'd lost. "Your sister," she began hesitantly as they rode through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. "What was her name?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. His body tensed slightly behind her, and his breathing seemed to pause. "Patricia," he finally said. "Patty. She was 18 when they took her. Our parents died of fever the winter before, and we were trying to make it on our own. I went to Laramie for supplies, and when I came back..." His voice trailed off. "The neighbors said men came, claimed our parents had debts. Took her to settle them. And you've been searching ever since?" "Every town, every mining camp, every ranch within 300 miles. I find work, ask questions, move on when I'm sure she's not there." He fell silent again, then added, "2 years ago, I won some money in a poker game. Enough to buy the ranch. Figured I needed a home base for my search, somewhere I could always return to." "You'll find her," Bethany said with conviction. Preston didn't respond, but his arms tightened slightly around her, not in an improper way, but with a gratitude that needed no words. Late in the afternoon, they crested a hill, and Preston reined in the horse. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Callahan Ranch." Below them stretched a picturesque valley. A creek wound through pasture land where cattle grazed in scattered groups. Near the center sat a substantial log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, and several smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney, and in the distance, Bethany could make out the figures of men moving among the cattle. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Preston's cabin proved to be larger and more comfortable than Bethany had expected. Built of solid pine logs, It featured a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms separated by a short hallway. Simple but sturdy furniture filled the space, and though there were few decorative touches, the large windows emitted plenty of light, giving the home an airy, welcoming feel. "This will be your room," Preston said, showing her to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher. "It's not much, but it's clean. It's lovely," Bethany said honestly, setting her carpetbag on the bed. After the cramped corner she'd been given in her uncle's cabin, this room felt like a palace. "I'll let you get settled," Preston said. "I need to check in with my hands, see how things went while I was away. The kitchen's stocked if you're hungry." After he left, Bethany explored her new surroundings. The kitchen proved to be well equipped, if utilitarian, with a cast iron stove, a pine table with 4 chairs, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Through the window, she could see a small garden plot, though it appeared somewhat neglected, with more weeds than vegetables. Acting on impulse, she found herself rolling up her sleeves and setting to work. By the time Preston returned, she had a pot of stew simmering on the stove, fresh cornbread in the oven, and the table set with the surprisingly nice dishes she'd found in a cupboard. Preston stopped in the doorway, clearly startled by the transformation. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to," Bethany replied. "It helps me think." She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious. "I hope you don't mind that I used your supplies." "Mind? No, He cleared his throat. "It smells wonderful. Better than anything this kitchen has seen in a long while." They ate dinner together, the silence between them gradually becoming more comfortable. Preston asked about her parents, her life before Silverdale, and listened with genuine interest to her answers. In turn, he shared stories about building the ranch, the challenges of the harsh winters, and his plans for expanding the herd. "I invited my hands to join us," he said as they cleared the dishes. "But they're shy around new folks. Especially women. They live in the bunkhouse by the barn." "Perhaps another night," Bethany said. "Once they're used to me being here." Preston paused, a plate in his hand. "About that. I meant what I said about helping you get wherever you want to go. But you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The garden could use attention, and I'd be glad to pay you fair wages for keeping house. The men and I manage, but—" He gestured around the kitchen, which despite her afternoon's efforts still showed signs of bachelor living. "I'd like that," Bethany said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "At least until I figure out what comes next." The next few weeks fell into a pleasant rhythm. Bethany rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Preston and his hands Hank, a grizzled older man with a permanent squint, and Diego, a quiet Mexican vaquero who rarely spoke but whose eyes crinkled warmly when he smiled. She spent her days reviving the garden, cleaning the long-neglected cabin, and preparing meals that brought genuine appreciation to the men's faces. Preston was gone most days from sunup to sundown, working with the cattle, mending fences, and tending to the 1,000 tasks required by a working ranch. But in the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence. Bethany found herself looking forward to these quiet hours, to Preston's low voice as he described his day or read aloud from one of the dog-eared books that lined a small shelf beside the fireplace. On Sundays, Preston drove her to church in Juniper Creek in his wagon. The small community welcomed her warmly, particularly the minister's wife, Martha, who immediately invited Bethany to join the ladies' quilting circle that met every Wednesday afternoon. "It'll be good to have another young woman around," Martha said after services on Bethany's 3rd Sunday. "And might I say, Preston Callahan looks happier than I've ever seen him." "You're good for him, dear." Bethany felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that. He's just been kind enough to give me work and a place to stay." Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced, but she changed the subject gracefully. "Will you be coming to the Founders' Day celebration next month? The whole county turns out for it. The idea of a celebration lifted Bethany's spirits. "I'd love to, if Preston doesn't mind." "Mind? Child, that man would give you the moon if you asked for it. Haven't you seen the way he looks at you?" Bethany dismissed Martha's words as the romantic imaginings of a happily married woman, but later, as Preston drove them back to the ranch, she found herself stealing glances at his profile. The summer sun had darkened his skin, making his blue eyes seem even more striking in contrast. There was a quiet strength to him that had nothing to do with his physical build, though that was impressive enough. It was the way he carried himself, the steadiness in his gaze, the careful consideration he gave before speaking. "Something wrong?" he asked, catching her looking. "No," she said quickly. "I was just thinking about what Martha said about the Founders' Day celebration." "Ah, that?" Preston nodded. "It's quite the event. Dancing, food, games for the children. The whole town comes alive." He glanced at her. "Would you like to go?" "I would," Bethany said. "Very much." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Then we'll go." The next morning, Bethany was weeding the now flourishing garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw a rider approaching at a leisurely pace, leading a second horse laden with bundles. It wasn't until the visitor was nearly at the gate that she recognized Hank's son, who occasionally brought mail and supplies from town. "Morning, Miss Miller," he called, tipping his hat. "Got a delivery for you from Mrs. Henderson at the general store." Bethany wiped her hands on her apron, puzzled. "For me? There must be some mistake. I haven't ordered anything." The young man grinned. "No mistake. Mr. Callahan arranged it all last week. Said it was to be a surprise." He began unloading several wrapped packages from the packhorse. "Where would you like these?" Still confused, Bethany directed him to place the bundles on the porch, then offered him a glass of lemonade and a slice of the apple pie she'd baked that morning. After he left, she approached the mysterious packages with curiosity. The largest contained lengths of fabric fine cotton in a delicate blue floral pattern, rich burgundy wool, and a luxurious emerald green silk that made her gasp. Another held buttons, ribbons, and lace trim, while a third contained a pair of leather boots that looked to be exactly her size. The final package revealed a ready-made dress in a pretty shade of lavender, far nicer than anything Bethany had owned before. She was still staring at the items in disbelief when Preston returned for the midday meal. He stopped at the sight of the unwrapped goods spread across the table. "Do you like them?" he asked, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. "They're beautiful," Bethany said, running her fingers over the silk. "But I don't understand." "Why would you, for Founders' Day?" Preston explained. "And, well, you've been working hard. You deserve nice things." He shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Henderson helped choose everything. I hope the colors are right." Bethany felt tears pricking at her eyes. No one had given her a gift since her parents died. "They're perfect," she whispered. "But it's too much." "I can't possibly accept, please," Preston said, taking a step closer. "It would make me happy to see you in a dress worthy of you." Something in his eyes, a warmth, a longing, made Bethany's heart beat faster. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find other words. That evening, after Preston had gone to help Diego with a sick calf, Bethany took out her mother's small sewing kit and began measuring the green silk. By the light of the oil lamp, she worked on a pattern, thinking of the dresses she'd admired in the pages of Godey's Lady's Book at the general store. The silk would be perfect for Founders' Day, she decided, imagining how it would look as she danced. The thought brought her up short. Dancing meant partners, and the only partner she could imagine was Preston. The realization that she wanted him to hold her, to guide her around a dance floor, sent a rush of heat to her face. When had her feelings for him changed from gratitude to something deeper? The next morning, she rose before dawn, unable to sleep. Moving quietly so as not to wake Preston, she slipped outside to watch the sunrise from the porch. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Beautiful, isn't it? She turned to find Preston standing in the doorway, already dressed for the day's work. He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers as they gazed at the horizon. It's my favorite time of day, Bethany admitted. Everything feels new, full of possibility. Preston nodded. That's why I bought this land. First time I saw the sun rise over that ridge, I knew this was where I belong. He hesitated, then added softly, Lately, I've been thinking there's more to belonging than just a piece of land. Before Bethany could respond, Diego appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, waving urgently. Boss! Riders coming! Looks like trouble! Preston's expression immediately hardened. Stay inside, he told Bethany, his voice leaving no room for argument as he strode toward the barn, calling for Hank. From the window, Bethany watched as 3 riders approached the ranch. Even from a distance, she could tell they weren't friendly visitors. They sat their horses with aggressive confidence, and as they drew closer, she recognized the center rider with a jolt of fear, Horace Blackwood from Silverdale. Preston met them in the yard, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. Hank and Diego flanked him, both armed as well. Though she couldn't hear the conversation, Bethany could see Blackwood gesturing angrily, occasionally pointing toward the cabin. Preston's posture remained calm but unyielding, his head shaking firmly in denial of whatever demands were being made. The confrontation lasted several tense minutes before Blackwood spat on the ground, yanked his horse around, and rode off with his companions. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Preston lower his rifle and turn back toward the cabin, his face grim. What did they want? Bethany asked as soon as he entered. Preston's jaw tightened. Blackwood seems to think he has some claim on you. Says your uncle promised you to him before the auction and took money for it. Horror washed over Bethany. That's not possible. I would have known. It doesn't matter if it's true, Preston said. You're not property to be bought and sold. Even if Morris did take his money, it doesn't give Blackwood any rights over you. What did you tell him? That you're under my protection now, and if he values his life, he'll ride back to Silverdale and forget he ever saw you. Preston set his rifle by the door. But I don't think he'll give up that easily. Blackwood's not known for taking no for an answer. Fear coiled in Bethany's stomach. Will he come back? Preston nodded grimly. Probably. But not today, and not alone. He'll gather more men first. He took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. I won't let him take you, Bethany. I promise you that. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. I'm not worth you risking your life, she whispered. You are to me, Preston said simply, and in those 4 words, Bethany heard everything he wasn't saying. Before she could respond, he released her hands and stepped back. I need to talk to Hank and Diego, make sure we're prepared if Blackwood returns. We'll take turns keeping watch. After he left, Bethany sank into a chair, her mind racing. She had no doubt Preston would fight to protect her, and that was precisely what terrified her. Blackwood was known to be ruthless, with connections to some of the worst elements in the territory. If he returned with enough men, even Preston, Hank, and Diego might be overwhelmed. The thought of Preston being hurt, or worse because of her, was unbearable. Yet the alternative, returning to Silverdale and Blackwood's protection, was equally unthinkable. For the next few days, tension hung over the ranch like a thundercloud. Preston insisted Bethany remain close to the cabin while he and his men took turns watching the approaches to the property. Despite the precautions, life continued. Cattle needed tending, meals needed cooking, and the gardens still required daily attention. On the 3rd evening after Blackwood's visit, Bethany was setting the table for dinner when Preston entered, looking more relaxed than he had in days. Good news, he said, washing his hands at the kitchen pump. Got word from a friend who passed through Silverdale yesterday. Blackwood's saloon burned down the night before. No one was hurt, but he'll be too busy rebuilding to cause trouble for a while. Relief washed over Bethany. That is good news. More than you know. Preston dried his hands on a towel, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Means we can still attend Founders' Day next week without worrying about unwelcome visitors. The celebration was only 8 days away, and despite the recent tension, Bethany had continued working on her dress in the evenings. The green silk was taking shape into something she was genuinely proud of, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that would swirl beautifully when she danced. "I'd like that," she said, returning Preston's smile. "I've been looking forward to it." "So have I," he admitted, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that sent warmth spreading through her chest. With the threat of Blackwood temporarily lifted, the mood at the ranch lightened considerably. Preston spent more time at home in the evenings, often sitting at the kitchen table while Bethany worked on her dress, telling her stories about his childhood in Ohio before his family had moved west. "My father was a dreamer," he said one night as he whittled a piece of pine into what was gradually taking shape as a small horse. "Always chasing the next opportunity, the next horizon. Mother was the practical one, making sure we were fed and clothed while father built castles in the air." "You take after your mother then," Bethany observed, looking up from her stitching. Preston considered this. "In some ways. But I've got my share of father's dreams too." His eyes met hers briefly before returning to his carving. "Just learn to build them on solid ground." On the morning of Founders' Day, Bethany woke early, filled with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She bathed using the precious lavender soap Martha had given her, then spent extra time arranging her hair, pinning the dark waves into a style she'd seen in a magazine, with loose curls framing her face. When she finally donned the completed green silk dress, she could scarcely believe her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. The color brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and the cut of the bodice emphasized her slender waist before flowing into the full skirt. It was, without question, the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the main room, where Preston was waiting. He had dressed with care as well, in a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his usually tousled hair neatly combed. When he saw her, he froze, his eyes widening. "You look," he began, then shook his head slightly, as if words failed him. "Is it too much?" Bethany asked, suddenly uncertain. "No," Preston said quickly, stepping closer. "You're beautiful. The most beautiful woman I've ever seen." The simple sincerity in his voice made her heart swell. "Thank you," she said softly. "You look very handsome yourself." He offered his arm with a slight bow. "Shall we?" The drive to Juniper Creek was filled with an almost electric anticipation. Bethany found herself sneaking glances at Preston's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his hair. Occasionally, she would catch him looking at her as well, his expression soft and wondering, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Juniper Creek was transformed for the celebration. Bunting hung from every building along the main street, and tables laden with food lined the area in front of the church. A platform had been erected for dancing, with chairs arranged around it for those who preferred to watch. Children darted through the crowd, laughing and playing games, while a small band tuned their instruments on the platform. Martha spotted them immediately, hurrying over with her husband in tow. "Bethany! Preston! I'm so glad you could come. And my goodness, that dress is a vision!" As Martha drew Bethany away to introduce her to other ladies from the church, Bethany glanced back to see Preston watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. Throughout the afternoon, they were often separated by the natural flow of the celebration, but Bethany was always aware of where Preston was, just as he seemed to always know where to find her. When the dancing began as twilight fell, Preston appeared at her side, offering his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Miller?" The formality made her smile. "You may, Mr. Callahan." As he led her onto the platform, Bethany was suddenly grateful for the dancing lessons her mother had insisted upon years ago in their small eastern town. Preston proved to be an excellent partner, guiding her confidently through the waltz, his hand warm at her waist. Where did you learn to dance like this? She asked, surprised by his skill. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. My mother taught all of us. Said no child of hers would grow up a complete savage, even on the frontier. She taught you well, Bethany said, enjoying the way they moved together, perfectly in step. She'd have liked you, Preston said softly. Said a man needs a strong woman beside him to make a real home. The implication of his words sent a flush of pleasure through Bethany. They danced every dance that followed, reluctant to part even when the tempo increased and the movements became more lively. By the time the band paused for a break, Bethany's cheeks were flushed and her heart was racing from more than just the exertion. Would you like to walk for a bit? Preston asked, offering his arm. It's getting warm in here. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing. Stars blanketed the sky above them as Preston led her away from the noise of the celebration toward a small garden behind the church. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting a soft, golden glow over the flowers and benches. Are you enjoying yourself? Preston asked as they sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree. More than I can say, Bethany replied honestly. It's been so long since I've been to a celebration like this. She smoothed her skirt. Thank you for the dress. For everything. Preston took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. Bethany, there's something I need to tell you. The serious note in his voice made her tense. What is it? I received a letter yesterday. From a man I hired to look for my sister. Preston's eyes were intense in the lantern light. He's found her, Bethany. Or at least, he's found strong evidence of where she was taken. A ranch in Wyoming Territory. Joy and apprehension battled within Bethany. That's wonderful news. When will you go? As soon as possible. Within the week. He hesitated. I've thought about nothing else for 3 years. I have to find her, to bring her home if she's still alive. Of course you do, Bethany said, squeezing his hand. She's your sister. Preston drew a deep breath. The thing is, I don't want to leave you. These past weeks. He looked away briefly, then met her eyes again with newfound resolve. I've fallen in love with you, Bethany. I think I started falling the moment I saw you on that auction block, looking so brave despite everything. Bethany's heart soared at his words, even as fear clutched at her. Preston, I know it's sudden, he continued quickly. And I'm not asking for any promises. But I needed you to know how I feel before I leave. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving the horse he'd been working on. I made this for you. So you'll remember me while I'm gone. Bethany took the carving, running her fingers over the beautifully detailed figure. It's lovely, she whispered. Then, gathering her courage, she met his gaze. But you're wrong about one thing. It's not sudden at all. I've been falling in love with you a little more each day. The hope that bloomed in Preston's eyes was almost painful to see. Then you'll wait for me? I don't know how long I'll be gone. I'll wait, Bethany said firmly. For as long as it takes. Preston's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. May I kiss you, Bethany? In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache, the kiss sweet and undemanding. When they parted, his eyes held a promise that needed no words. They returned to the celebration hand in hand, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. For the remainder of the evening, they stayed close to each other, stealing private smiles and brief touches that spoke volumes. On the drive home, Preston explained more about his plan. Diego and Hank will look after the ranch, and you while I'm gone. I've arranged for Martha's husband to check in regularly as well. I'll be fine, Bethany assured him. The ranch is as much my home now as it is yours. Preston's smile at her words was worth all the uncertainty ahead. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Preston made arrangements for the ranch, settled accounts in town, and packed supplies for what might be a long journey. Bethany threw herself into ensuring he had clean clothes, mending anything that needed repair, and preparing food that would keep for the first days of his trip. The night before his departure, they sat together on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. Preston's arm was around her shoulders, holding her close against the evening chill. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence. "When I return with Patty, God willing, would you consider making our arrangement more permanent?" Bethany turned to look at him, her heart racing. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Preston Callahan?" He smiled, a touch of nervousness in his expression. "I don't have a ring yet, and this isn't how I plan to do this, but…" "Yes. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Bethany. If you'll be my wife and partner in everything." Joy bubbled up inside her like a spring. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." The kiss that followed sealed their promise, deeper and more passionate than their first. When they finally parted, breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come back to you," he vowed. "No matter what happens, I'll come back." The morning of Preston's departure dawned clear and cool. Bethany stood in the yard, watching as he made final adjustments to his saddle and provisions. When everything was ready, he turned to her, his eyes memorizing her face as if storing the image for the lonely days ahead. "I've left money in the strongbox in my room," he said. "More than enough for anything you might need. And the deed to the ranch is in there too, with your name added. Just in case, don't," Bethany interrupted, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Don't say it. You'll come back." Preston nodded, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I will. With Patty." Their goodbye kiss was bittersweet, full of promise and longing. Then he was mounting his horse, tipping his hat to her one last time before riding away. Bethany watched until he disappeared over the ridge, the rising sun glinting off his fair hair. The days that followed were both busy and achingly empty. Bethany threw herself into the work of the ranch, helping Diego and Hank where she could, tending the garden that now produced an abundance of vegetables, and keeping the house in perfect order for Preston's return. Each night she would sit on the porch, watching the horizon, holding the wooden horse carving like a talisman. Weeks passed. Martha visited often, bringing news from town and companionship that Bethany gratefully accepted. On Sundays she still attended church, praying fervently for Preston's safe return and his success in finding Patricia. A month after Preston's departure, the first letter arrived. Bethany's hands trembled as she broke the seal. "My dearest Bethany," it began, "I've reached Wyoming territory and have made contact with a man who knew the rancher who bought Patricia. The news is mixed. The rancher died last year, and his property was divided among relatives. I'm now tracking down each of them, hoping one knows what became of Patty." The letter continued with details of his journey and ended with words that Bethany read over and over. "I miss you more than I can express. The thought of you waiting at home gives me strength each day. All my love, Preston." More letters followed, arriving irregularly as Preston moved from place to place. Some brought hope, a sighting of a young woman matching Patricia's description, rumors of a woman freed from servitude who might be her. Others spoke of disappointments and dead ends. Through it all, Preston's devotion to Bethany shone through in every word. 3 months after Preston's departure, as autumn painted the landscape in rich golds and reds, Bethany was hanging laundry when Hank called out from the barn. "Riders coming, Miss Bethany!" Her heart leapt, then fell as she realized it was too soon for Preston's return. She hurried to the porch, where Hank was already waiting with his rifle. Diego appeared from the pasture, moving quickly to join them. As the riders drew closer, Bethany's blood ran cold. Leading the group of 5 men was Horace Blackwood, his face set in a determined sneer. They halted their horses at the edge of the yard. "Well, well," Blackwood called. "If it isn't the pretty little thief! Where's your protector now, girl?" "This is private property," Hank said, his voice steady despite his age. "You're not welcome here." Blackwood laughed, an ugly sound. "We're not leaving without the woman. She belongs to me. Her uncle took my money fair and square before Callahan interfered. I belong to no one," Bethany said, her voice stronger than she felt. Especially not to you, Mr. Blackwood. Brave words, Blackwood sneered. But Callahan's been gone for months. Word is he's not coming back. Found something better than a ranch and a used woman, I expect. The insult stung, but Bethany refused to show it. Mr. Callahan will return. And until then, this ranch and everything on it is under my protection and that of these good men. Blackwood's expression darkened. Have it your way. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. He nodded to his companions, who spread out slightly, hands hovering near their weapons. You take one step closer, Diego said quietly, and it will be your last. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of Blackwood's men shifted nervously. Maybe we should come back, boss. With more men. Blackwood shot him a venomous look but seemed to reconsider. This isn't over, he said, pointing at Bethany. I always collect what's owed to me. Always. With that, he yanked his horse around and rode off, his men following close behind. Once they were out of sight, Bethany's legs nearly gave out from relief and tension. Hank steadied her with a weathered hand. Don't you worry, Miss Bethany. Me and Diego won't let anything happen to you or the boss's ranch. I know, she said gratefully. Thank you both. That night, Bethany wrote to Preston, detailing Blackwood's visit and their response. She didn't want to worry him, but she knew he needed to be aware of the threat. She sealed the letter, planning to send it with Hank's son when he next visited. But as October turned to November, bringing the first dusting of snow to the high pastures, Bethany began to worry. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Preston's last letter, the longest gap since his departure. Each day, she watched the trail for any sign of a rider bringing news. The worry gnawed at her, making sleep difficult and food unappetizing. What if something had happened to him? What if Blackwood returned with more men? The wooden horse carving became her constant companion, a connection to Preston that she clung to during the darkest moments of doubt. One cold morning in late November, Bethany was kneading bread dough when Diego burst into the kitchen, his usually composed face alight with excitement. Riders coming! Many riders! Fear gripped Bethany's heart. Blackwood? Diego shook his head, grinning. No, Miss Bethany. It's the boss. And he's not alone. Bethany rushed outside, flour still dusting her hands and apron. In the distance, a group of riders was approaching, at least 5 or 6 from what she could see. Leading them was a familiar figure, tall and straight in the saddle. Preston, she whispered, her voice catching on his name. As the riders drew closer, Bethany could make out a slender figure riding beside Preston, a young woman with fair hair catching the winter sunlight. Behind them came several men who appeared to be hired guards or escorts. Bethany stood frozen in the yard, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Then Preston saw her. Even from a distance, she could see his face transform with joy. He urged his horse forward, pulling ahead of the others, and within moments was dismounting before her, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Bethany, he breathed, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides. She flew into his arms, heedless of the flour on her hands or the spectators watching their reunion. Preston's arms closed around her, solid and real and warm, and when his lips found hers, the world fell away entirely. I found her, he murmured against her mouth. I found Patty. Bethany pulled back slightly to look at his face, thinner than when he'd left, more weathered, with a new scar along his jawline, but still her Preston. I knew you would, she said, touching his cheek. The young woman had dismounted and was approaching hesitantly. The family resemblance was unmistakable. She had Preston's blue eyes and the same determined set to her chin, though her features were finer, more delicate. Patty, Preston said, one arm still around Bethany as he reached for his sister with the other. This is Bethany Miller, the woman I'm going to marry. Bethany, this is my sister, Patricia. Hello? Patricia said shyly. She was thin, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of hardship, but there was strength in her posture and a spark of resilience in her gaze. "Welcome home," Bethany said warmly, stepping forward to embrace the younger woman. "You can't imagine how happy we are to have you here." Patricia's arms came up tentatively to return the hug. "Preston told me everything. About how he saved you, and how you've been taking care of his home." She pulled back, studying Bethany's face. "He talked about you so much, I feel like I already know you." Over a hearty meal that Bethany quickly prepared, Preston explained what had happened. He had tracked Patricia to a remote ranch in Wyoming, only to discover she had been sold again to a mining camp owner in the mountains. Conditions there were. Preston's jaw tightened. No human should live that way. When I found her, she was working in the camp kitchen, 16 hours a day. The owner didn't want to let me go. Patricia continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Preston offered to buy me, but he refused. Said I was too valuable. So I took her, Preston said simply. In the middle of the night. We rode out with half the camp on our heels. That's when I hired the extra men for protection. He gestured toward the bunkhouse, where the hired guards were being settled. They'll stay until we're sure it's safe. And Blackwood? Preston asked, his expression darkening. Your letter reached me just before we started for home. Has he been back? Bethany shook her head. Not since that day. Hank and Diego have been vigilant. Good men, Preston said appreciatively. But I think it's time we settled this permanently. Blackwood needs to understand that neither you nor this ranch is ever going to be his. That evening, after Patricia had been settled in Bethany's room, Bethany would move into Preston's, a development that brought a blush to her cheeks despite their engagement. Preston and Bethany sat together on the porch. Despite the chill in the air, neither wanted to go inside just yet, too grateful for the privacy after the eventful day. I was so afraid you wouldn't come back, Bethany admitted as Preston held her close. Nothing could have kept me from you, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Every night, I fell asleep thinking of your face. Every morning, I woke determined to finish my search so I could return to you. Bethany turned in his arms to look at him. And now? What happens now? Now, Preston said, his eyes tender in the fading light. We build our life together. We help Patty heal from what she's been through. We expand the ranch, maybe add a few more rooms to the house for the children we'll have someday. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. If that's what you want. It's everything I want, Bethany whispered, leaning in to kiss him. The next morning, Preston rode into Juniper Creek with 2 of his hired men, returning by afternoon with news that made Bethany's heart lighter than it had been in months. I spoke with the sheriff, he said as they sat around the kitchen table. Preston, Bethany, Patricia, and the ranch hands. Turns out Blackwood is wanted in 3 counties for various frauds and assaults. The sheriff sent a wire to the territorial marshal, who's been building a case against him for years. So he won't be bothering us anymore? Patricia asked, the relief evident in her voice. Not if he values his freedom, Preston confirmed. And I made sure everyone in town knows that Bethany Miller is soon to be Bethany Callahan, with all the legal protections that entails. Bethany reached for his hand across the table, squeezing it gratefully. When? Preston's eyebrows rose. When what? When will I be Bethany Callahan? She asked, a smile playing at her lips. The answering grin that spread across Preston's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. How does Christmas sound? Just enough time for Patty to stand as your bridesmaid and for me to build that new bedroom I've been planning. Christmas sounds perfect, Bethany said, her heart overflowing with happiness. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a flurry of activity. Preston, with help from Hank and Diego, began construction on an addition to the cabin, a larger bedroom for him and Bethany, and a proper parlor where they could entertain guests. The hired guards departed after the marshal sent word that Blackwood had fled the territory, likely headed for California to escape prosecution. Patricia grew stronger each day, helping Bethany with household tasks and slowly opening up about her 3 years of captivity. The sisters-to-be formed a bond that went beyond their connection to Preston, finding in each other the family both had lost. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, Bethany stood before a small mirror in Martha's home in Juniper Creek, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. She wore a wedding dress of ivory satin, a gift from the ladies of the church, who had worked together to create it in record time. Her dark hair was adorned with a crown of holly berries and evergreen, and in her hands she held a bouquet of winter roses from Martha's hothouse. "You look beautiful," Patricia said from the doorway, resplendent herself in a dress of deep blue that brought out her eyes. "I can hardly believe this is happening," Bethany admitted. "A year ago, I was helping my mother with the washing, with no idea how my life would change." Patricia crossed the room to take Bethany's hands. "My brother is the best man I know. Even when everyone told him to give up searching for me, he never did. He'll love you the same way completely and forever." "I know," Bethany said softly. "And I'll love him the same." The church was filled with candlelight and the scent of pine boughs. Every resident of Juniper Creek had turned out for the wedding, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around. As Bethany walked down the aisle on the arm of the minister, her eyes found Preston waiting for her before the altar, handsome in a new suit, his face alight with love and pride. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. When Preston placed a gold band on Bethany's finger, one he had ordered specially from Denver, his hands trembled slightly, betraying the depth of his emotion. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of all the years to come. The celebration afterward filled the church hall with laughter and music. Preston and Bethany danced their first dance as husband and wife to the same waltz they had shared at Founder's Day, moving together as if they had been partners all their lives. "Happy?" Preston murmured as he held her close. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Bethany replied, resting her head against his shoulder. As midnight approached, they said their goodbyes and drove through the gently falling snow to the ranch to their home. Patricia had arranged to stay in town with Martha for a few days, giving the newlyweds privacy to begin their life together. In the warmth of their new bedroom, with moonlight filtering through the curtains and the sounds of the winter night surrounding them, Preston and Bethany discovered each other fully for the first time, their love expressed in touches and whispers and promises that needed no words. Later, as Bethany lay in the circle of her husband's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here from the auction block to this moment of perfect belonging. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About how sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best," she said, looking up at him. "If my uncle hadn't put me on that auction block, I would have found you anyway," Preston said with conviction. "Some things are meant to be, Bethany Callahan." She smiled at her new name, at the rightness of it. "I believe that too." Spring came early that year, bringing new growth to the land and new beginnings to the Callahan ranch. Patricia had blossomed in the safety of her brother's home, developing a talent for bookkeeping that proved invaluable as Preston expanded his cattle operation. Bethany's garden doubled in size, producing enough vegetables to sell the excess in town. On a warm evening in May, as the three of them sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Bethany placed Preston's hand over her still flat stomach. "I have news," she said softly. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but the words that followed, whispered against her lips between kisses, were ones she would treasure forever. "Thank you for making my life complete." 5 years later, the Callahan Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the county. The original cabin was now a comfortable home with 6 rooms, including a nursery for 3-year-old James and his baby sister Grace. Patricia had married a young lawyer who had come to set up practice in Juniper Creek, and they lived in a small house at the edge of town, expecting their first child. On the anniversary of their wedding, Preston took Bethany for a ride to a hilltop overlooking their property. The valley below was green with spring growth, cattle dotting the pastures, the ranch buildings neat and well maintained. "Do you ever think about that day in Silverdale?" Preston asked as they spread a blanket for their picnic. Sometimes, Bethany admitted, unpacking the basket she had prepared. It seems like another lifetime. Another person. Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. I had this made for you, he said, handing it to her. Inside was a locket of gold, intricately engraved with roses and vines. When Bethany opened it, she found a miniature portrait of their family on one side and, on the other, a tiny wooden horse, a perfect replica of the carving Preston had given her at Founder's Day. So you never forget how our story began, Preston said, fastening the chain around her neck. And how far we've come. Bethany touched the locket, then reached up to draw her husband down for a kiss that held all the passion, tenderness, and gratitude of their years together. I could never forget, she whispered against his lips. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. Preston smiled, the Wyoming sun bringing out the gold in his hair and the blue of his eyes. No, my love. We saved each other. As they shared their anniversary meal on the hilltop, watching their children play on the blanket beside them, Bethany thought of all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment: the tragedy of losing her parents, the cruelty of her uncle, the auction that had seemed like the end of her life but had instead been its true beginning. From the darkest moment of her life had come its greatest joy, proof that even in the wild, untamed West, love could flourish in the most unexpected places, even on an auction block, where a cowboy with kind eyes had paid not just with his money, but with his heart.